The hall was already filled with soft movement before the event even began. People were arriving in groups, their shoes clicking gently against the polished floor, their voices mixing into a quiet background hum. The room had been prepared carefully for the evening. Chairs were arranged in neat rows, lights were adjusted to a warm glow, and a long polished piano stood at the front like it had been waiting for something important to happen. No one paid much attention to it at first. It was just part of the decoration for most of the guests. The focus of the evening was not music. It was a formal gathering, a place where people came to meet, talk, and enjoy a controlled sense of elegance. Music was only expected to be a soft background detail, something to fill silence when needed. Near the side of the hall, a young woman stood quietly. She was dressed simply, not in a way that would draw attention. Her posture was calm, almost invisible among the crowd of well-dressed guests. She held a small folder in her hands, not tightly, but carefully, as if she was used to staying unnoticed. She was not part of the main group. She had not been introduced with any special announcement. In fact, most people who passed by her did not even remember seeing her face a moment later. She had been asked to come earlier than others, but even that request had been vague. It was not clear why she was needed. She was told only that she might be required to help with a small musical moment during the evening. Nothing serious, nothing important, just a simple tune if needed. The words had been said in a way that made it sound like a favor rather than a responsibility. She agreed without asking questions. That was her nature. She did not argue or demand details. She simply nodded and arrived on time. As the hall filled more, the energy slowly shifted. Conversations grew louder, laughter became more frequent, and glasses clinked gently as people greeted each other. The atmosphere was elegant but casual, the kind where appearances mattered more than depth. The young woman stayed near the piano, waiting quietly. She did not sit. She did not try to join conversations. She simply observed. Her eyes moved across the room slowly, noticing details most people ignored. A waiter adjusting glasses. A guest fixing their tie in reflection. A small group laughing a bit too loudly at something that was not that funny. She noticed everything but reacted to nothing. From a distance, she looked like someone who did not belong to any specific place in the room. Not important enough to be at the center, but not entirely absent either. She existed in the space between attention and invisibility. A few guests eventually noticed her standing near the piano. One or two exchanged quiet comments. They assumed she might be part of the service staff or maybe a helper assigned for music setup. No one thought much beyond that. Time passed and the event officially began. A host stepped forward and welcomed everyone with practiced confidence. The speech was polished and smooth, filled with words about appreciation, gathering, and shared moments. People listened politely, though many were already thinking about conversations they would have afterward. After the introduction, attention slowly drifted. The structure of the event allowed for pauses, and in one of those pauses, the idea of background music was mentioned casually. Something light, something simple, just enough to keep the atmosphere pleasant. It was then that someone remembered the young woman standing near the piano. A small gesture was made in her direction. Not dramatic, not formal. Just a slight indication that it was time. She noticed immediately. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. There was no reaction from the crowd at first. People were still talking softly, not fully aware that something was about to begin. The young woman walked with steady steps toward the piano. Each step was quiet, controlled, and unhurried. It was as if she had walked this path many times before, even though no one there had ever seen her do it. When she reached the piano, she paused for a moment. Her hand touched the edge lightly, not as if testing it, but as if acknowledging it. Then she sat down. Only a few people were now paying attention. Most still assumed it would be something simple. A short tune. Something forgettable. Perhaps even background music that would blend into conversations. She placed her hands gently above the keys. For a brief moment, there was silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from expectation, but the kind that exists when something is about to begin and no one realizes its importance yet. Then she played. The first notes were simple, exactly as expected. Soft, controlled, almost basic. Nothing about it suggested anything unusual. It was correct, precise, and unremarkable. A few people nodded and turned away, already losing interest. Some resumed their conversations. One or two even checked their phones. But she continued. The melody remained simple, but something about it began to shift. Not in a way that was immediately noticeable, but slowly, like a change in air pressure before a storm. Her fingers moved with calm certainty. There was no hesitation, no visible effort. She was not looking at the audience. She was not seeking approval. She was fully focused on the piano, as if the world beyond it had stopped existing. The notes began to carry something extra, a softness that felt intentional, a timing that was slightly different from what was expected, a flow that seemed too natural for something so simple. One guest paused mid-conversation, not because they understood what was happening, but because something had interrupted their attention without explanation. Another guest glanced toward the piano, then looked away, then looked back again. The music was still simple, but now it was no longer forgettable. The young woman's expression did not change. She remained calm, almost distant, but her hands began to move with more confidence. The melody grew slightly richer, though still within the boundaries of what had been requested. It was as if she was following instructions that no one else could hear. In the front row, a few people started to pay closer attention. Not because they were impressed yet, but because something about the sound made them unsure whether to ignore it or listen. The atmosphere in the hall shifted without announcement. Conversations became shorter. Laughter faded. Chairs adjusted slightly as people began to turn their bodies toward the piano. Still, no one spoke. The performance had not yet reached anything extraordinary. But it was no longer ordinary either. And the young woman continued to play, unaware of how quickly the room was beginning to change around her. The room had settled into a calm rhythm, but it was not the same calm as before. Something had shifted after the first few notes, even though most people could not explain it. At first, they had treated the music like background noise, something that came and went without meaning. But now, a small change was spreading quietly through the hall, like a feeling that no one wanted to admit yet. The young woman continued to play without looking up. Her hands moved gently across the piano keys, steady and controlled. There was no rush in her movements, no sign that she was trying to impress anyone. She played as if she was alone in the room, even though the hall was filled with people watching her more closely than they realized. A few guests who had been talking earlier now found themselves quieter than they intended. It was not a sudden silence. It was gradual. One person stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Another lowered their voice without knowing why. Conversations that once filled the room began to break apart, replaced by small pauses that kept growing longer. At the back of the hall, a group of attendees stood near the refreshment table. They had been relaxed just moments ago, laughing softly and discussing unrelated topics. But now, one of them glanced toward the piano and did not look away. It was not clear what had caught their attention. The music was still simple, still within the expected tune. And yet, something about it felt different enough to make them stop and listen. The woman at the piano remained focused. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable. She did not look at the audience. She did not react to the growing attention. Her world seemed contained within the keys in front of her. The melody continued to flow, but now it carried a subtle depth. The notes were the same in structure, but the way they were played gave them a slightly richer tone. It was not loud or dramatic. It was soft, almost like a quiet story unfolding slowly. Some guests began to shift in their seats. Not out of discomfort, but out of curiosity they did not fully understand. A man near the center leaned slightly forward, as if trying to catch something he might have missed. A woman nearby tilted her head, listening more carefully than she had intended. Still, no one spoke. There was an unspoken hesitation in the room, as if people were unsure whether they were allowed to react yet. The performance had not broken any expectations, but it had also stopped being forgettable. It was living somewhere in between, and that space made people uncertain. The young woman's fingers moved with growing confidence. The simple tune remained recognizable, but it was no longer flat or plain. There were small changes in timing, slight variations in pressure, gentle pauses that gave the music a deeper feeling. It was as if she was shaping something that did not exist before, even though she was working with something very familiar. At the edge of the hall, a few staff members exchanged quiet glances. They had been assigned to manage the event, not to analyze performances. But even they could feel something unusual developing. One of them stopped walking mid-step and turned slightly toward the piano, listening more closely than their task required. The audience was now divided in a strange way. Some people were still half distracted, trying to hold on to their conversations. Others had completely turned their attention toward the front. And a few were somewhere in between, unsure whether what they were hearing was worth noticing or not. The music continued. The woman did not change her posture. She did not show signs of nervousness or pride. She simply continued playing, as if the piano was an extension of her thoughts. A soft shift in the melody caught more attention than anything before. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it changed the direction of the tune. The simple structure began to feel more layered, as if hidden depth was slowly rising to the surface. One guest stopped mid-movement while lifting a glass. The glass remained in the air for a second longer than necessary before being placed back down. The person did not realize they had paused. They were simply listening. Another guest, seated closer to the front, leaned forward slightly, their expression changing from casual interest to focused attention. It was subtle but clear. Something had pulled them in. Still, the young woman did not acknowledge the audience. Her attention never left the piano. It was as if she was following a path only she could see. The tune remained simple in its foundation, but the emotion behind it began to deepen. It was no longer just a melody. It started to feel like a quiet conversation, though no words were spoken. The hall, which had once been filled with scattered noise, was now noticeably quieter. Conversations had faded into murmurs and then into silence. Even those who had not intended to listen found themselves stopping. A sense of curiosity spread through the room. People began to wonder if they had missed something earlier. Was this still the same simple tune they were told about? Or had something changed without them realizing? The young woman's hands moved with steady control. There was no visible effort, but the music carried a growing emotional weight. It felt intentional, as if every note had a purpose beyond its sound. At one point, she paused for just a fraction of a second between notes. It was not long enough to be considered a break, but it was enough to change the feeling in the room. That tiny pause created tension, and then release. Several people reacted without realizing it. A slight breath, a small shift in posture, a quiet moment of attention sharpening. The atmosphere had now fully changed. What was once a casual background performance had become something people were actively listening to, even if they could not yet explain why. The young woman remained composed. There was no change in her expression, no visible sign of awareness about the growing attention. She simply continued to play step by step, note by note. The simple tune still existed, but it was no longer simple in feeling. It had begun to carry something deeper, something that made people feel like they were hearing more than just music. And yet, at this point, no one in the room knew what it was becoming. The room had changed in a way no one fully understood, but everyone could feel it. What started as a simple background performance had now become something that quietly demanded attention. The air felt different, as if the space itself had slowed down to match the rhythm of the piano. The young woman continued to play with the same calm expression. Her posture was steady, her shoulders relaxed, and her eyes remained focused on the keys. She showed no awareness of the growing attention behind her. It was almost as if she had stepped into a private world where only she and the piano existed. The tune was still recognizable as simple. It had not broken into anything dramatic or loud. And yet, something within it had begun to deepen. The notes were arranged with care, but the feeling behind them was becoming stronger with each passing second. In the middle rows of the hall, people were now fully turned toward the front. Conversations had completely stopped. Even those who had earlier shown no interest were now watching quietly. There was no announcement telling them to pay attention. It happened naturally, as if the music had slowly pulled their focus without permission. A man who had been leaning back in his chair now sat upright. His expression had shifted from casual boredom to quiet curiosity. He could not explain why he was listening so closely now, but he did not look away. Nearby, a woman gently placed her hand on the table in front of her and leaned forward slightly. Her eyes stayed fixed on the piano. She had not intended to become interested in the performance, but something in the sound had reached her in a way she did not expect. The young woman's hands moved with smooth control. The melody remained simple in structure, but it now carried subtle layers that made it feel richer than before. It was not loud, not fast, and not complicated in the usual sense. Instead, it had a kind of emotional depth that was difficult to describe. It was as if the music was slowly revealing something hidden beneath its surface. At the edges of the hall, a few guests exchanged silent glances. They were not speaking, but their expressions showed confusion mixed with curiosity. They were trying to understand what exactly had changed. The tune had started as something forgettable, yet now it held their attention completely. One of the staff members near the wall stopped adjusting a table setting. Their hands remained still for a moment as they turned toward the piano. It was not part of their job to listen, but they could not ignore the sound anymore. The hall had now entered a state of quiet focus. Even the smallest sounds, like the shifting of chairs or the soft movement of clothing, became more noticeable because the music had reduced the background noise of the room. The young woman continued without hesitation. Her fingers moved confidently, pressing each key with precision. There was no sign of nervousness or distraction. She appeared completely absorbed in the moment. Then something subtle happened again. The rhythm shifted slightly. It was not a dramatic change. Most people would not have noticed it in isolation. But within the flow of the performance, it created a feeling of movement, as if the music had taken a gentle turn in direction. Several listeners reacted without realizing it. A few leaned in closer. Others narrowed their focus. The atmosphere became more concentrated, more serious, even though no one had spoken a word. The simple tune now carried a strange sense of depth, as if it was telling a story without words. People did not know what story it was, but they could feel that there was one. The young woman's expression remained unchanged. She did not smile, nor did she show tension. Her face stayed calm, almost distant, as if she was unaware of how deeply the audience was reacting. At one point, she played a series of notes slightly softer than before. The change was small, but it created a noticeable emotional shift in the room. The audience did not move, but their attention tightened. A quiet stillness spread further. Even those who had been sitting comfortably now found themselves sitting a little straighter. The room felt more focused, as if everyone had collectively decided, without speaking, to pay closer attention. The melody continued to evolve gently. It was still based on the original simple tune, but now it had become something far more expressive. The way she shaped each note gave the impression of careful thought behind every movement. It was no longer just music meant to fill silence. It had become something that held silence. A few guests glanced at each other briefly, as if silently confirming that they were all experiencing the same thing. There was no need for words. The shared reaction was enough. The young woman remained completely steady. Her hands did not rush. They did not hesitate. Each movement was smooth and controlled, as if she had complete understanding of every note before playing it. The piano itself seemed to respond differently now. The sound felt fuller, more present, filling the hall in a way that made it hard to ignore. The audience was now fully engaged. Even those who had tried to remain indifferent could no longer avoid paying attention. The performance had quietly taken over the room. Still, no one knew what was coming next. The simple tune had not yet transformed into anything dramatic, but it was building toward something that felt just beyond reach. And the young woman, sitting alone at the piano, continued to play as if she already knew exactly where it was going. The silence in the hall had become heavier than anyone expected. It was not the uncomfortable kind of silence people usually try to break. It was different. It was the kind that forms naturally when everyone is focused on the same thing without needing to be told. The young woman continued to sit at the piano, her hands moving steadily across the keys. The simple tune was still there, but now it felt like it was breathing. It rose and fell gently, as if it had a life of its own. Each note carried a quiet intention, and the room seemed to follow every small change without realizing it. People were no longer distracted. Phones were forgotten on laps. Conversations had completely stopped. Even those who had not planned to pay attention now found their eyes fixed on the performer. The performance had not become loud or fast. It had not turned into something dramatic or showy. Instead, it had started to grow in depth. The kind of depth that makes people listen more closely without knowing why. At first, the notes remained simple, clean and familiar, but then, something subtle changed. The timing between notes became slightly more expressive. A gentle pause here, a soft connection there. Nothing obvious, but enough to change the feeling in the room. A few people exchanged quiet looks. They did not speak, but their expressions carried the same thought. Something about this was not ordinary anymore. The young woman's posture remained unchanged. She did not move differently. She did not show any sign that she was aware of the audience's reaction. Her focus stayed entirely on the piano. It was as if the rest of the room did not exist. And yet, the room was fully under the influence of what she was creating. The melody slowly started to shift again. Not in structure, but in emotion. It began to feel more layered, more expressive. The simple tune that had been requested at the beginning now carried a sense of depth that no one had expected. A man seated near the center of the hall leaned slightly forward without thinking. His hands rested still, but his attention had sharpened completely. He could no longer look away. Near him, a woman tilted her head slightly, as if trying to understand something she could not put into words. She had expected a short, forgettable performance. Instead, she found herself quietly absorbed in every note. The atmosphere in the hall was no longer casual. It had turned serious, not in a formal way, but in a deeply focused way. Everyone was listening now, even those who tried not to show it. The young woman's fingers moved with steady control. There was no rush, no hesitation. Each movement felt natural, as if the piano responded directly to her thoughts. Then something changed again. A slightly deeper note entered the melody. It was soft, but it carried weight. That single change made the entire tune feel different. It was as if the music had taken a step forward into something more emotional. The reaction in the room was immediate, though still silent. People did not speak, but they reacted in small, subtle ways. A shift in posture, a slight widening of eyes, a quiet intake of breath. The performance was no longer just being heard. It was being felt. The simple tune now had layers of feeling hidden inside it. It was still recognizable, but it was no longer predictable. It moved in ways that made listeners unsure of what would come next. The young woman's expression remained calm. She did not look at the audience. She did not look for approval. She stayed fully immersed in the piano, as if she was following something only she could see. The room felt smaller somehow, even though nothing had physically changed. It was as if the music had drawn everyone closer together without movement. A few guests who had been sitting farther back now leaned slightly to get a better view. They were no longer interested in the event itself. Their attention had shifted entirely to the performance. The melody continued to grow in emotional strength. It was still gentle, still controlled, but it now carried a deeper sense of expression. Felt like a story being told slowly, without words. And yet, no one could identify the story. The young woman's hands moved in smooth rhythm. Occasionally, she added a soft variation to the tune, something small that changed the feeling just enough to keep the audience engaged. Each variation seemed intentional but effortless. At one point, she played a short sequence slightly slower than expected. The change was almost unnoticeable, but it created a moment of tension in the room. That tension was not uncomfortable. It was curious. It made people wait. And then she continued. The release of that tension came naturally through the next set of notes. The audience felt it without thinking. It was like a quiet emotional wave passing through them. A few people realized they had been holding their breath. The young woman did not react. She simply continued. The piano sounded fuller now, as if the instrument itself had changed. The hall's acoustics made every note feel more present, more alive. The simple tune had now evolved into something far more expressive than anyone had expected at the start. The audience was completely silent, not because they were told to be, but because they no longer wanted to break the moment. Even the smallest sounds in the hall became noticeable. A slight movement of clothing, a quiet shift in a chair, but none of it disturbed the performance. The young woman's focus never broke. Her expression stayed steady. She appeared completely unaware of the growing impact of her performance. But the room was fully aware now. Everyone understood, without speaking, that something unusual was happening. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply meaningful. And the music continued to unfold, gently pulling the entire hall deeper into its hidden emotion, one note at a time. The atmosphere in the hall had now fully changed. What began as a simple background performance had turned into something no one could ignore. The silence was no longer accidental. It was chosen, shared, and held by everyone in the room without a single word being spoken. The young woman remained at the piano, calm and steady. Her posture had not shifted since she began. Her expression stayed composed, almost distant, as if she was completely inside the music and nothing else existed around her. But the room around her had transformed. People who had once been relaxed were now fully focused. Conversations had ended completely. Even small movements had slowed down, as if the audience was afraid to disturb something fragile and important. The melody continued, still built on the original simple tune. But now it no longer felt simple at all. It had grown layers of emotion that could not be easily described. It was no longer just sound. It had become a feeling that moved through the room. Every note seemed to carry meaning. Every pause felt intentional. The young woman's hands moved with quiet confidence. There was no hesitation in her playing. She was not searching for notes. She was not adjusting or correcting. It felt as if the music already existed somewhere, and she was simply bringing it into reality. The audience noticed it now more clearly than before. A man near the middle row slowly leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on his knees. His eyes stayed fixed on the piano. He was no longer thinking about where he was or why he was there. His attention had narrowed completely to the performance. Nearby, a woman's expression had softened. She looked as if she was remembering something, though nothing in the room suggested what that might be. The music seemed to touch something personal inside her without explanation. The melody shifted again. It was still gentle, but it had started to rise in emotional strength. The sound became richer, fuller, and more expressive. The simple tune was no longer just a melody. It had become a journey. A few listeners noticed a small change in rhythm. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it changed the way the music felt. It no longer followed a predictable pattern. Instead, it moved like a story unfolding in real time. The room reacted quietly. No one spoke. No one moved suddenly. But the attention in the hall tightened even further. The young woman's fingers moved slightly faster for a brief moment, then slowed again. That contrast created a wave of emotion in the music, something that made the audience feel a shift they could not fully understand. It was as if the music was speaking without words. At this point, even those who had been skeptical at the beginning were fully engaged. There was no more doubt in the room. Whatever they had expected before no longer mattered. The performance had taken on a life of its own. The young woman did not look up even once. Her focus remained entirely on the piano. She seemed unaware of the way the audience was reacting. Or perhaps she simply did not need to see them. The melody deepened again. This time it carried a stronger emotional weight. The simple tune had now evolved into something far more expressive. It felt layered with quiet emotion, like memories hidden beneath sound. A few people in the audience subtly adjusted their seating, as if trying to feel more comfortable while listening. But there was no discomfort in the room. It was something else. Something deeper. A kind of emotional attention that made stillness feel natural. The music flowed smoothly, but it was no longer predictable. Each section seemed to open into the next like a soft, unfolding story. At one moment, the young woman played a series of notes that rose gently, then paused. That pause was not long, but it felt significant. It created a space in the music that held the entire room still. No one moved during that moment. Then she continued. The release of that pause felt like a quiet breath being let go by the entire hall at once. The audience did not realize how deeply they were now connected to the performance. It was no longer just something they were watching. It had become something they were experiencing together. The young woman's hands moved with even greater expression now. The control in her playing was clear, but so was the emotion. It was balanced perfectly without effort or force. The melody began to rise again, not in volume but in feeling. It became more intense, more expressive, more alive. A few listeners felt a slight emotional response they could not explain. It was not sadness or happiness alone. It was something in between. Something that felt personal even though the music belonged to everyone in the room. The hall remained completely silent. Even the smallest sounds had disappeared. It was as if the world outside the piano had been paused. The young woman's expression remained unchanged. But her playing now carried a quiet power. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady and deeply moving. The simple tune had now transformed completely. It was no longer simple. It had become something hidden inside something familiar. Something that revealed itself slowly, note by note, to those willing to listen. The audience was no longer waiting for what would happen next. They were already inside it. And the music continued, gently pulling them deeper into a moment that none of them would forget. The final part of the performance felt different from everything that had come before it, even though no one in the hall could clearly explain why. The atmosphere was still quiet, still focused, but now there was a deeper emotional weight in the air. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something important to finish. The young woman continued to sit at the piano with the same calm presence. Her hands moved across the keys with steady control, but now every movement felt even more intentional. The simple tune that had started everything was no longer simple at all. It had grown into something layered, something rich with feeling that seemed to reach every corner of the hall. People were completely still. No one spoke. No one shifted in their seats. Even those who had been skeptical at the beginning now watched in full silence, as if they understood that interrupting this moment would break something they could not repair. The melody slowly began to change again. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gently, like a soft turning of pages in a book. Each note felt carefully placed. Each pause carried meaning. The music now felt like it was reaching its final shape, as if it had been building toward this moment from the very beginning. A few people in the audience felt something unexpected. Not excitement, not confusion, but something closer to emotion they had not prepared for. It was subtle but real. A tightening in the chest. A quiet stillness in thought. A sense that something meaningful was unfolding right in front of them. The young woman did not look up. Her focus remained entirely on the piano, but her playing now carried a deeper emotional strength. It was no longer just skill being shown. It felt like something being expressed that could not be spoken. The melody rose gently once more. It was still soft, still controlled, but now it had a sense of final movement, like a story slowly approaching its last page. A man seated near the middle row lowered his gaze slightly, then looked back at the piano again. He did not move after that. His expression remained fixed, as if he did not want to miss even a single note. A woman nearby quietly pressed her hands together in her lap without realizing it. Her attention had become so complete that even her body reacted without thought. The music continued to grow, but not in volume. It grew in depth. Each note seemed to carry more meaning than the one before it. The hall remained completely silent, but the silence was no longer empty. It was full of attention, full of emotion, full of something shared between everyone in the room. The young woman's hands moved slightly slower now. The rhythm had changed again, becoming more reflective, more open. It felt like the music was beginning to close a circle. The simple tune from the beginning could still be recognized somewhere inside it, but now it had transformed so much that it felt like a memory of itself rather than the original form. A few listeners realized something quietly. They had stopped thinking about the performance as something happening in front of them. They were now inside it, carried by it, without resistance. The melody softened further. The piano sound became lighter, more delicate. Each note seemed to float for a moment before settling into silence. The young woman's expression remained unchanged. Calm, focused, almost distant, but her playing now carried something deeply human. Something that could not be measured by skill alone. It felt like expression shaped through experience, even though no one in the room knew anything about her life. The final part of the performance slowly began to form. The notes became more spaced. The pauses grew slightly longer. The music was no longer building. It was releasing. A quiet sense of completion started to spread through the hall. People could feel it, even if they did not know how to describe it. This was the end approaching. The melody softened again. Now it was almost fragile. Gentle enough that even the smallest sound in the hall felt like it might break it. But no one moved. The entire room held still together. The young woman played the final sequence with care, as if placing something delicate into the world for the last time. Each note was clear, each pause meaningful. The simple tune that had once been introduced as something ordinary had now become something unforgettable. And then, slowly, the final notes arrived. They were soft, not dramatic, not sudden, just gentle, steady, and complete. The last sound lingered in the air for a moment after her hands left the keys. And then silence. A deep, complete silence filled the hall. No one reacted immediately. It was as if everyone needed a moment to understand that it was truly over. The young woman remained still for a second longer, her hands resting lightly near the keys. Then she slowly closed the piano cover with quiet care. She stood up, still calm, still composed. She did not look at the audience. She did not wait for reaction. She simply stepped away from the piano. For a few seconds, the hall remained silent. No movement. No sound, just stillness. Then, slowly, the realization began to spread. People started to move. First a few hands, then more, then the entire hall. Applause began softly at first, scattered and unsure, then grew stronger, filling the room completely. It was not loud in a chaotic way. It was steady, respectful, and full of admiration. People stood up. Some clapped continuously. Some simply looked toward the front, still trying to process what they had just experienced. The young woman did not return to the piano. She did not bow dramatically. She simply turned and walked away at a calm pace. As she moved toward the side of the hall, the applause followed her. Many eyes remained on her, but she kept her focus ahead. There was something about the way she left that made the moment feel even more powerful. No celebration, no attention-seeking. Just quiet departure after something extraordinary. And then she was gone from the center of the hall. But the feeling she left behind remained. People slowly began to sit back down, but the energy in the room had changed permanently. Some spoke quietly to each other now, trying to express what they had just witnessed. But words felt insufficient. It was not just a performance they had seen. It was a transformation. A simple tune had turned into something deeply moving, something that revealed hidden depth in a way no one expected. And even after she had left, the memory of that music stayed in the room, in the silence, and in the minds of everyone who had been there. No one in that hall forgot what they had just heard, and no one could fully explain how a simple request to play a tune had become a moment that felt like discovering a hidden legend.